my friends, this is part 3, the final part of why Gondor survived as long as it did. This is part 3, we're going to call it the slow decline. And one of the things to look at is in the years between the Kin-strife, after the Kin-strife and its fallout, and the War of the Ring, we see the Great Plague, we see a lot of conflict. A lot of conflict. It's just one invasion after another. Now, some of these invasions come in shorter increments than others. Some they have some space of watchful peace or just relief in between. Keeping in mind that for the Dunedain, the high men of Gondor, even though their own bloodlines are in a slow decline, they age faster than they used to. They still live longer than the average man, so they're going to see these conflicts occur in a more rapid manner than the rest of the citizens of Gondor. Once again, majority of these conflicts are held away from Gondor proper, from the heart of Gondor. So it's one thing to be fighting conflicts in foreign land, on the frontier, on the borders. It's another thing to be in the heart of your kingdom, disrupting the everyday life and functions and operations thereof. It's hugely different. This is one of the reasons why the raids from the Corsairs could have a much more impact than Wayne Riders coming from the far northeast. It's just the fact is that the Corsairs are actually getting into and closer to the heart of Gondor and interacting with its citizens. For a large portion of the average everyday Gondorian who isn't on the frontier, who isn't in the military, their impact is negligible to their lives. Their lives are going to see some hardship, some suffering, unlike when the Great Plague and the Kin-strife takes place, because that's up and in their business. These foreign foes over time don't affect them as much. It makes it easier for them to continue on with the status quo or the everyday chore of living. So in 1810, 38 to 1810, Telemeter, the king, captures Umbar. In 1851 to 1856, we see waves of Wayne Riders coming out of Rohirrim, and run to tackle or to encroach on the borders of Gondor's furthest frontier, and at the time forcing Gondor to slowly withdraw from those borders and to constantly put resources and men and material forward to the frontier to deal with these battles. 1899, we see another battle with the Wayne Riders occur at Daggerlad. A year later, 1900, Kalimr builds the White Tower at Minus Ithil. So you can see at this point that even though Gondor is on the slow decline, it's still quite powerful. This great white tower is added to Minus Ithil and there's still a king seated on the throne. So from the year between 1900 and 1943, we see much of minor wars with the Rain Riders and Carrigs to the north and northeast, and the Herodom to the southeast. Nothing overtly major in invasion mindset kind of thing, but this constant skirmishing, this constant pressure that's being placed on Gondor's borders, and once again slowly forcing the Gondorians to expend men and resources and time, and occasionally having to withdraw slightly to strengthen those frontiers. They're still influenced, they still have quite a bit of power, and they're still quite strong, but it takes its toll. If you look at how Arnor fell apart, especially in the latter centuries when it was just Arthedain going it alone, the Witch King, he took the long road, the long view. He had time. He was undead. That's just the truth. He would keep pressure, and then he would withdraw, and then he would pressure again, and he would withdraw, and it was only occasional major confrontations. But it took hundreds and hundreds of years for him to wear down the Gondorian or the Anorian Dunedain to the point that they just weren't going to endure a major campaign, and when a major campaign came, the inevitable happened. But that inevitable took a long time. So we see something similar to this in the South. We see this long, drawn-out thought of a program. So Sauron and his lieutenants occasionally assault Gondor, but they're wise enough to know that if they openly assault Gondor in a major confrontation during these years, they're going to lose. They don't have the resources, and the fact that the Gondorians can continually put forward manpower and resources in far enough regions away from the heart of Gondor, whether it's at sea or it's on land, prevents any of these groups from achieving a ultimate sacrifice or ultimate goal, or you know what I'm saying. So it's about the year 1936 to 1940. Arnor and Gondor renewed contact and alliance. And at this time, I think it's Erdui weds for freely for Hari, the daughter of the king of Arthedain. Then we have 1944, which is the Wainwright and Harridan invasion and the Battle of the Camp, where they are heavily defeated, and they cease to become a threat for some time. This reduces the pressure on Gondor to the point where Gondor's king is able to send a force north to help Arnor ideally defend itself, but they arrive too late. 1975, they have the Battle of Fornost, and roughly the year, it's shortly after that Arnor falls, and Gondor's, with elven help, arrives too late to do anything. Witch King is also defeated in the north in a perfect victory. He still wins because Arthedain is no more as a country. The country of Arnor has ceased to exist. He withdraws, and suddenly a year or two later launches an assault on Minus Ithil and captures the city of the moon. This is a crucial event in a couple aspects when we look at this slow decline period. For the first time in Gondor's history, perhaps the first time in Númenor's history, does a major Númerian city fall and become captured and occupied by the forces of evil. Now, yes, Fornost fell. The Witch King's minions sacked the city, destroyed a big chunk of it. But the other Arthedain city and large towns in the north did not. And for the most part, this is one of the reasons I said in earlier videos, Arnor's weaknesses, is they didn't have any large concentrations of manpower. They just didn't. There was only 2 major cities and a number of seriously large outposts or citadels in the north. Tharbad fell, and the capital of Rador barely, Amundin or Camden or something. It barely constitutes being a city, more like an oversized town, and it's just the seat of power for that region. And then Anomus, the original capital of Arnor, it fell into decline and was abandoned. It didn't get sacked or destroyed. It just fell apart. It was abandoned. So the city of Fornost became the concentrated seat of power in Númerian bloodlines, Dunedain, in Arnor, and then it's destroyed more or less in the last battle with the Witch King. So when the Witch King comes south, and he manages to not only invade Ithil, but capture Minus Ithil, occupy it, which meant he fortified it sufficiently enough that Gondor makes no serious attempt to retake it. Gondor is I don't know, so shocked by this sudden success that they just can't muster the will to retake the city, or at least sack it and destroy it and prevent it remaining in the hands of the Dark Lord and his minions, or they just simply can't. It's just they're at a point in their decline that it's just not. It would be a perfect victory for them, so they choose not to. So this psychic think in your psyche. This cultural wound is inflicted on Gondor as a nation, that they have lost one of their key cities. There are only 4, maybe 5 major cities in Gondor that we know of. There may be a couple very large towns or tiny, or would be small cities, but we know Poligr is the largest. Osgiliath was the largest, the capital, but it was sacked and destroyed and partially destroyed during the Kin-strife, and in conflicts later years it becomes pretty much a ruin. But it's still occupied at this point. Minus Tirith, or Minus Arnor at the time, would have been the largest northern city of significant population. And you can add Dol Amroth as probably a fairly large contingent, though as city goes, I don't know. It's hard for me to know the exact numbers. We can kind of guesstimate. But so here the Witch King takes a major city from Gondor and inflicts itself on a major province. Ithil is a significant province of Gondor. Everything east of the river is now in doubt. There's no significant large population centers outside of Minus Ithil on that side of the river between Mordor and the Anduin. So we're going to see a large number of the Ithil population begin to flee and migrate. They're feeling no longer safe, no longer at home in their homes, and are going to migrate west across the river. This is further weakening Gondor's influence over Ithil. So for the first time in Gondor's history, has a home province and a home city fallen to an enemy, and in such a manner the enemy retains it to the end. Ithil is regained after Aragorn becomes king and Sauron's destroyed. Minus Ithil is deemed irredeemable or not too dangerous to try to reoccupy. So Aragorn has it destroyed to the stones, to the foundations. He has it destroyed and forbids anybody to live anywhere near it, ever. So how poignant is that to Gondor? That is the first serious bellwether sound, the first major sign not all things are good anymore. And we still have a king. Gondor still has its king. So some 40 years later, during 2043 to 2050, King Arnor takes the Witch King's bait, disappears, leaving Gondor without an royal heir. So here comes the second bell, second chiming of the grand slide. The king's blood comes to an end, and there's no acceptable, viable replacement for him because he died. He has no children, and against all advice, he actually thinks he can go and accept the Witch King's challenge in a one-on-one conflict. That the Witch King somehow is going to be honorable in any manner. That's just absurd. Just not gonna happen, right? So at this point, Gondor is left without a king, and the ruling stewards take over. Now it's a testament to the Numerian or the Gondorian Dunedain's mindset and faith that they just don't make the steward's bloodline the next king, a new line of kings. At no point, I'm sure this has had to have been brought up. It had to have been discussed. It had to have been bandied about by the various advisors and nobles of the kingdom. And out of blood relation, we know that it's a good possibility that a prince of Dol Amroth would have a legal claim to the throne as some distant cousin. And there are several other lordly owned territories are controlled that potentially could have that claim too. And then there's the nobility claim. So we have dukes and barons and counts and so on. They don't mention them a whole lot in Tolkien's works, but they're there. We know they're the lords of the various territories and provinces of Gondor. And so by definition of top leadership, one of them potentially would have a claim to the throne. So why does none of these people step up and either make a demand or make a heavy push? The Kin-strife comes back to mind right away. The Kin-strife wasn't so many years ago, so many decades ago, that some of these people don't at least remember the outcome from secondhand. Their grandfathers, their fathers telling them about that time. They can't afford another civil war. They cannot afford to have fighting over the throne, because it would further diminish the kingdom. Also, it's so ingrained. Isildur's line, Isildur, Eldil's bloodline, the mythology behind it, is so ingrained in the Dunedain of Gondor that they can't accept the idea of somebody not of that bloodline being a formal king. This is one of the reasons the stewards don't just take control and name themselves kings. And this is why Dol Amroth's princes do not come forward and challenge kingship. Now, this is why the senior lords of the realm do not push or demand a kingship, in my eyes, in my opinion. Right? So, the end of 2050, we finally have the end of the line of kings of Gondor. Apparently the bad guys are satisfied with this for a while. So there's nearly 400 years of what calls the watchful peace. Gondor maintains its watch, its borders. There's still minor skirmishing, but nothing is significantly worth noting in the history books as some kind of point on history where it makes a major impact. It's this open wound of Minus Ithil still sitting there. The loss of the last of their Isildur bloodline, or Anorian's bloodline in Gondor. The fact that none of them know that Isildur's line continues in Arnor through the chieftains. But the stewards do their job and do it fairly effectively. The lords of the land bend their knee to the stewards as a de facto king, granting them or upholding any of their edicts and rules. And this allows the country to recover and see a resurgence, a slight respite at least. Nothing major goes wrong, nothing major goes good either. The Gondor is still on a slow decline at this point. And we reach the year 2475, the Third Age, when the sudden onslaught out of Mordor and Minus Ithil, they attack Osgiliath, Sauron's forces, occupy the eastern side of the river, and sack and destroy most of the city. What's left is ruined, and the city's abandoned for good as a population center. So at this point, the only thing left here would be garrisons and fighting men and the government agencies that are trying to interfere with and repel Mordor sources. This also further cuts off Ithil as a province. At this point, it's probably no longer feasible for Gondorian forces to travel through Ithil unless it's in great force. The bridges are blocked off on the other side of the river. You can cross by boat, but it would be a major event to take enough people across that river to make a difference. This also causes them, Gondor, to some degree, to further withdraw from those far-flung borders. Those areas of Rohirrim, south and east of Mirkwood, for example, and north of and west of the Sea of Rhûn, that were formerly, at least in territory mindset, under the sway of Gondor, are more or less abandoned as the settlers and people that were stationed there are withdrawn, because now they're in threat of being cut off. You can't push forces through Ithil. You can't push supplies through Ithil. The supplies have to go up the western side of the river, or up the river proper, and are under constant possible harassment from the eastern side of the river. And land travel through the washes, the Intwash, for example, would be pretty difficult in any large quantity, in my opinion. It's not so much that it don't happen, but it's tough. This leads to the Balkoth and Orc invasion in 2510. So, 3rd Age, 2510, we see the next major invasion, second major invasion in 500 years, after the loss of and just abandonment of Osgiliath as a population center. It's during this period that the steward Siren cuts a deal with Earl the Young, and the Rohirrim arrive at the nick of time and attack the Balkoth from the rear and enable the Gondorian forces to achieve a victory. While this is going on, Gondor once this is settled, Gondor invites the Rohirrim to migrate south and take over the northern province of Cardalhorn, however it's pronounced, and which now becomes Rohan. About 200 years after this, the Rohirrim are getting settled in. Gondor's people are more or less migrated south, closer to Minas Ithil, or to the south of the mountains. About 2710, Dunlandings occupy Isengard. Now, they don't occupy it for a long period. They don't occupy it for long, but this was a very prominent and very important post for numerous reasons, starting with the fact that the Isengard is a massive fortress tower and houses one of the Plantari. It's a cultural icon and a somewhat neo-religious thing that the Gondorians are not going to be able to suffer lightly, that we have yet another major iconic place. Minus Ithil first, Osgiliath second, and now Isengard is now no longer in their control. So while they're trying to figure out what to do with this, and Rohan's not really situated to do anything on their own, about 30 years later, we have a series of attacks by the Corsairs. So from 2758, 2759, roughly 38 years after the occupation of Isengard, and 200 years after the Rohirrim arrive, the Corsairs attack in force. They raid Gondor. Rohan is attacked and overrun by Dunlandings and Orcs, as well as some tribes from the east. They're forced to hide or go defend themselves. This is where the Battle of Helm Hammerhand becomes mythology. It's not looking good at all. At this point, Gondor defeats or challenges the forces of Umbar and the Corsairs and push them back or hold them off, as well as send an army north to relieve the Rohirrim and to push the Dunlandings back through the gap and then reclaim Isengard, at least in name. Things are just constantly being pressured. Things are going downhill. Then the year 2872, the White Tree dies for its second time or third time. And that's a cultural, religious, significant thing to the Dunedain, the Gondorian Dunedain. The Gondorians are looking at this as a sign. Things are not boding well. And Gondor is further diminished in its ability and its power base and its mindset. A few years later, we see yet another invasion. This time in 2885, the Harridan invade Ithil, and you have the battle at the crossings of Poros. Now, Gondor succeeds in winning this battle, but at great cost to its army. Keeping in mind that its army operating, and any army force operating east of the river, is at a great disadvantage because they do not have complete control of the river crossing, the bridges at Osgiliath, and they no longer have any population base of worth in Ithil itself. They also are dependent on traveling, needing ship and barges and what have you to cross the river and to maintain any forces there. So the forces that they did have of Southern Ithil are successful in beating off the Harridan, but they also have their backs kind of cut off by the fact that Minus Ithil is still occupied by orcs and minions of the Witch King, and the areas of Ithil is abandoned or dangerous to travel through. It's still powerful. Gondor is still powerful enough to beat these people off, but it's kind of the last great hurrah until the War of the Ring for Ithil. So in 2901, officially Ithil is deserted, and Caer Andros is fortified, because now Caer Andros is the only serious portage point for any kind of land force of significant size to get across the river Anduin until you go way to the north. It says that even at the Carrock, it's very hard to cross. So it's important that we don't see a whole lot of Caer Andros. It's briefly mentioned in the books, in the movies, but we never really see it. But I imagine it's an island in the middle of the Anduin that's heavily fortified, and it guards a ford, an area of low rocky territory where the river probably is wide but shallow, and you're capable of crossing with wagons on horseback and maybe even on foot. So it'd be very important to keep that fortified. At least the forces of Sauron managed to find a way to get across in force and cut you off from the north, which they did attempt on numerous occasions. I think that was the sole purpose where the Battle of the Camp was in the Battle of Daggerlad. Anyway, so 2911 to 2912, we see the Fell Winter, which really is only noticed significantly in the far north. It doesn't affect the south, but there are a lot of implications that things are still getting darker. So another 40 years pass, and 2951, Sauron declares himself openly in Mordor. So Sauron returns to Barad-dûr. Barad-dûr is rebuilt on its original foundation stones, and then he comes and occupies it and declares himself. At this point, it has to be a social shock, a cultural shock, a great fear to Gondor's population that the great enemy has returned and is boldly acknowledging his return. And he's now reoccupied what once was a deserted, guarded land that Gondor had wrested with the last alliance, the help of the last alliance from Sauron, hundreds and hundreds of years before. So now things are expediting. We're getting into the last couple of years for the War of the Ring. 2953, Sauron seizes Isengard. 2954, Mount Doom erupts and Theoden is completely deserted. The year 3000 plus is the prelude to the War of the Ring. So, Gondor is not completely down and out. It's still not anywhere near where it was at the height of its glory, let alone in the years right after the Kin-strife. Many sources on the internet have speculated just what, or just how much Gondor could field militarily wise during the War of the Ring. And the books are kind of, they don't give exact numbers, but they give you enough to figure that Gondor was able to put into the field about 25,000, a force of 25,000 men. And only a token of them, only several thousand, respond to the call to aid Minas Tirith. And it's when we light the beacons, that's one of those things that the book got and the movies forgot or chose to left out, that there's a line of beacons on both sides of the mountains. And the beacons to the south were lit before the beacons to Rohan were lit. And so this is where we get that small parade outside the gates that Pippin and that young boy witness of all the Outland captains coming and Prince of Dol Amroth coming with what they could bring. And the reasons is well documented, well talked about as why they didn't bring more forces. That's because you've got the Corsairs threatening to the south. You have another potential army of Harridan and Southrons coming up through the crossing of Poros and South Ithil, or North Harridan, however you want to look at it, to threaten the southern provinces. They need to be maintained. Gondor has a fleet. It needs to be occupied. The fleet is engaged in combat at Peligr. when Aragorn and the army of the dead arrive. But we hear nothing of it in the movies. It's in the books, and it's very briefly touched on. But this gives you the show that the bulk of Gondor's forces are in the south, fighting the war. They are fighting in conflict. They are holding off larger contingents of reinforcements that could have made the battle at the Pelennor Fields significantly worse and significantly larger forces. And Mordor's forces, Sauron's forces, are so powerful, so large, that not only does he have an 80,000 man sword, probably against a city of 6,000 or 7,000 defenders, but he has enough forces to put forces across the northern roads to prevent Rohan from arriving without a major conflict. It's only through the Dúrdain help and the, quote, stone road through the forest that allow Rohan to circumvent those outlying pickets and forces to come to the heart of the battle in a nick of time. There's also conflict at Caer Andros and other locations, just in smaller numbers. We also know that through secondary sources and appendixes in the book, that there was a major conflict in Mirkwood. The elves of Lorne and Thundrel's kingdom came together to defeat the forces out of Dol Guldur. There were conflict at the Lonely Mountain and in Dale with forces. There were conflicts all up and down the Misty Mountains and the Anduin River. It's just a massive war that's not. It's all shown more or less at the Battle of Pelennor Fields in and around Minus Ithil. So the fact that that Gondor at this late point in the games can still feel a sizable army, 25,000 men in a medieval era, is not. It's not a wishy-washy contingent. And these are trained soldiers for the most part. There's probably additional militia levies and other volunteers and things like this. They probably field upwards of 50 to 60,000. They're still going to be grossly outnumbered. Even Theoden talks about at the mustering at Dunharrow. He was disappointed by the outcome. They had 4,000 or 5,000 riders show up, but he was expecting 2 or 3 times that number. The fact that there was still conflict in the Eastfold, that the orcs were still on the raiding and pillaging, and goes to show you that they just couldn't bring all those forces to bear in time. In part, this is Denthar's failure for not acting sooner. Of course, Rohan was in the grips of Rohan's king was in the grips of Saruman, and they still had to deal with Saruman. And had the Saruman been successful at Helm's Deep, the battle at the Pelennor Fields would have been much worse for the side of Gondor. It might have still been successfully won because Aragorn would have had the forces of the army of the dead behind him until he released them, but it still would have been uglier. So there you have it. Part 3. My take in the history of the slow decline of Gondor, and yet its strengths and triumphs. Strength 1 is most of its core provinces were not inflicted directly by any of the wars or conflicts. The occasional Corsair raid, yes, but for the lion's share, no. The fact that they're a proud people, they're a capable people, helps. And then you look at the fact that Gondor maintained its own professional army and not some conscripted force with a handful of noble, captains and stuff. So we have a well-trained, well-disciplined, well-armed military, even at this late stage. And it was just enough. Just enough to achieve what needed to be achieved. Till next time, this is Rick. Enjoy your weekend.